What is up, guys? Retro Inception here today to give you your video review on God of War Ascension for the PlayStation 3. Now, just in case any of you don't know, God of War Ascension is not a sequel to God of War 3. It is in fact a prequel to the original trilogy. Now, I know how Clan Retro is primarily 360 based, but like I said, Redux and I both own a PS3, so you can expect plenty of footage from us in that department, especially with Last of Us coming out this year. We're doing a large amount of coverage on that. Let's talk about the graphics in God of War Ascension.
Kratos, the great Spartan general, was finally defeated. Driven mad, tortured and uncertain of his surroundings, the warrior found himself captured like a fly in the web of the Furies.
Never again.
Let me start off by saying that God of War Ascension is the most technically impressive game in the entire 4-console game library. Now, it looks really good. God of War 3 looked great, a lot better than a 2010 game. God of War 3 had graphics that could pass for amazing even today in 2013. And God of War Ascension just furthers that very high quality and standard of amazing visuals that really propel the narrative forward and help make a solidly cinematic experience. Now, as a reviewer, I really don't take graphics into too much consideration. I'd really rather talk about writing and gameplay, and God of War Ascension really makes the graphics a focus. So I'm talking about it a little bit here, but I really don't have a whole lot to say about like how the graphics look. It's kind of uninteresting to talk about how the game looks graphically. Really, the gist of it is it looks amazing, better than the last 3 console games and the 2 PSP ports. Probably one of, if not the best looking game on PS3 right now. Maybe that's going to be surpassed by Last of Us, but who knows? The game looks great. They nailed it in the graphics department. Now let's talk about the writing and narrative in God of War Ascension.
Sister, Electro was never one for manners. Not to worry. I am quite skilled at teaching respect. For what you've taken, I owe you that.
Surprisingly, and unfortunately, the narrative and plot is the worst part about God of War Ascension, where the first 3 games and even the PSP ports were based off of and fueled by the graphic revenge of Kratos and how he's trying to kill every god upon Olympus. It's really compelling and violent and interesting and refreshing and new. God of War Ascension feels really boring, and it's really because the main characters, which are the gods and the titans, are gone. You're pretty much just fighting enemies that feel like enemies from the first game. It's not very refreshing. It feels fairly bland. It's not that well written. Kratos himself doesn't even talk until like 30 or 40 minutes into the game, and it makes his character just really bland and he's uninteresting. Most of the game is just him walking around killing stuff, and then there's a few cutscenes of dialogue, and that's really disappointing to me because in the first 3 games, Kratos is a really interesting and original character, and it's awesome just playing along through his revenge-fueled and blood-soaked quest to kill everyone up on Mount Olympus. And in this game, you get captured by these Furies, and you spend the game trying to kill the 3 of them, and then of course there's like these filler missions that you have to use to get to each different Fury, and it just feels kind of uninspired. It's not as fresh or original as the first 3, and partially that's because of the gameplay, but I'll get to that in a minute. It's just really disappointing to me because it feels like Sony Santa Monica was just a little bit lazy on this one. Maybe God of War Ascension is just filler for God of War 4 on the PS4, and they just wanted to put Ascension out so this God of War franchise didn't become less popular. Just there would be a solid entry in between God of War 3 and 4, and that is just upsetting because I have a PS3, right? But I always use my Xbox a lot more, but there are always these great PS3 exclusives that I get. This year I was thinking it was going to be Ascension and of course Last of Us. And Ascension has really disappointed me. It's not really giving me a huge reason to just go and play my PS3 over my Xbox. And that's not good. And I mean, I'm always happy for some more God of War. And the combat, which I'll talk about in a second, and gameplay is fine, and all that holds up fairly well. And the multiplayer is actually pretty decent. But the plot is unengaging, disengaging. And that when you're disengaged from the plot, it's not easy to just play through that game. It feels boring, like you're kind of slogging through it. It's not interesting, it's half baked. But regardless, it still is a God of War game, so there are definitely these interesting set pieces and a few good villains. Some of the there's a huge abundance of mini boss battles, and those are all pretty cool. They're all really interesting. They have cool takedowns, so it gets kind of a pass. But you know that the people that make this game can do a lot better because you've seen it in God of War 3 and 2 and 1, and it's disappointing that they didn't put in as much effort as they needed to make this a fully fledged God of War game. And I want to make something absolutely clear, and that's that while the plot is a little disappointing for a God of War game, it's still fine just for a game. It's a lot better than a lot of other games' plots and writing. It's just not on par with the first three games, but you could do a lot worse. There are a lot worse games out there. God of War Ascension's writing is a letdown, but it's not game breaking. Now I think we should probably talk about the gameplay. While the gameplay is fun as always in a God of War game, it feels a little bit stale in this one. You've got the amazing and epic scope of the huge boss battles that shift the environment, and those are really fun, and there's always the mini bosses at the end of certain waves of grunts that are really interesting and sometimes challenging to take down. But when you're facing these grunts, just wave after wave of grunts, it gets a little bit boring to tell you the truth. And that's disappointing, but it's not that awful. It's not like you have to slog through these waves of grunts to get to the best parts. It's still overall fairly redeeming and makes the game pretty fun. They do this thing where you get these 4 elemental powers on your Blades of Chaos, which are, I believe, lightning, ice, fire, and souls. I don't even understand souls. It's not even an element, but whatever. It's implemented pretty well. You get to use the D-pad to select between them once you get the 4, and they can affect different enemies in several ways, and it makes the game seem kind of fresh. It doesn't really do a whole lot to get rid of that boringness of the grunts, but overall the combat in God of War is, while similar to the first three, still quite amazing because, let's face it, that's what Santa Monica knows how to do. Even though they also know how to do story, they just kind of screwed up this time. But with the gameplay, it kind of makes God of War Ascension more worth the purchase. Now let's talk about the brand new multiplayer in God of War Ascension. The multiplayer, yet again, is just kind of a bizarre mixed bag. I don't know what went wrong, but this game isn't terrible. It's just so half-baked. It was really interesting for the first few rounds. It's pretty much God of War combat, but they slow it down a little bit so no one can just completely overtake another person. And the maps are fairly interesting. It's a really original idea. There's just something about it. It's just not that fun to play for a long amount of time. It's not just going to become like the new COD. It's not going to take over the leaderboards. It's an interesting idea. It's a good game to play a few times in terms of multiplayer, but you're going to get bored of it eventually. However, a lot of critics are slamming it and saying it's just a bust and it's awful, which isn't true. It's not terrible. It's just not as great as I expected it to be. However, it's good for a few matches, but it doesn't really give that longevity and replay value to the game that you would expect it would. Now let's talk about the final verdict for God of War Ascension. While God of War Ascension is disappointing in terms of God of War games, it's not that bad as an actioneer on its own. It has a lot of solid redeeming qualities despite a generally poor narrative that doesn't entrance you and capture you as much as the first three games do, and combat that feels a little bit stale due to age. There wasn't a whole lot they could have done there because it's just the game getting old. It's not really them being lazy in that department. They were a little bit lazy in terms of the writing. If they decide to do God of War 4, I'm sure I'd probably get it, but I'd really want to see the reviews a bit more first. I hope they take a little bit more time working on that game, just put in a little bit more effort in terms of the narrative, also make it a bit longer, and while the game is definitely violent, just make it a little bit more interesting by adding a kind of backstory to the violence, not just Kratos being a pissed off dick that gets captured. That would make a lot more sense to go back to that revenge-fueled, blood-soaked way of traditional God of War games. God of War Ascension isn't worth $60. It's worth about 45 to 30. That's not a length thing. It's just for me, it feels like a little bit of a rehash. If you're a really supreme God of War fan and you really want to get this game, then sure, it's probably worth the 60. But to anyone else, it's really not the PS3 exclusive we're looking for quite now. My final verdict for God of War Ascension is a 77 out of 100. This is Retro Inception signing off.